Hey there, fellow foodies. This is Dr. Quave, and you're listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious. Now, this week on the show, we're going to cover one of my favorite topics, and that is boozy botanicals. And I have just the perfect guest for this topic. We have Camper English. He's a cocktails and spirits writer and speaker who's covered the craft cocktail renaissance for over 15 years. He's contributed to more than 50 publications around the world, including in Popular Science, Saveur, Details, Whiskey Advocate, and Drinks International. With a focus on the nerdy side of mixology, he has studied everything from the history of carbonation to the science of clear ice and ice cubes. His books are Doctors and Distillers and the Ice Book, and his website is alchemics.com. I've been following his work for a while on social media, and it's always fun when you meet somebody. I guess, well, we're still through a screen, not in person, but I feel like I know you in some way, Camper. So it's great to finally meet you in person.
Likewise, great to meet you as well.
Yeah. So why don't we dive into kind of just the beginning? What got you interested in writing about this topic of botanicals and their role in these various cocktails?
Well, it all started with a gin and tonic. I was writing kind of a trend story for Saveur on the gin and tonic and wanted to bring in a little bit of the origin of the drink. And, I think we all know the quinine in the tonic water was there to prevent and cure malaria. But I realized that I didn't have a date that was cited as the creation date of the drink. Just that was probably in India in the 1800s. And so I thought incorrectly that because medicine is so much better documented than drinks are, that I would find more information in history of medicine books. So I read a whole bunch of books about the history of malaria. And it was fascinating. Malaria is such an old disease that basically you get all of the history of medical thought when you study the history of malaria alone. And I found that alcohol was there in every form all along the way. And I had only known until that point kind of fun facts like, oh, quinine for malaria and citrus for scurvy and things like that. But realized that there was enough for an entire narrative looking at the history of medicine and alcohol and how they're really tied together throughout most of history until recently. But I didn't ever find a better date for the gin and tonic in any of those books that I studied. I did eventually find the first known reference just using a Google Books search, and it was at a horse race in India. And they're like, oh, after the race, we retired for drinks of gin and tonic and brandy and soda and etc. And at that point, it had already become a recreational beverage, clearly by the way they were referred to it. So yeah, the gin and tonic put me down the path, and at that point, I started collecting all the information about every other medicinal beverage I could find.
That's amazing. Well, I mean, this intersection with malaria is an interesting one because I know you've also written about wormwood, and wormwood is Artemisia species, and there's another therapy for malaria that comes from wormwood. So you have two plants that are useful medicinally, but also have some delightful kind of food values. Um, what can you share with us about wormwood and its role in cocktails?
Well, wormwood is, I think most people that you hear wormwood, we think of absinthe,
Hmm.
famously bad for you, makes you go crazy, and which is not really true, but it's the grand wormwood, which is used in absinthe. There are many Artemisia species, and they're used in many different beverages as well as in foods. But the grand wormwood is the most bitter of the wormwoods, and we know it from absinthe. And but absinthe, if you drink it, it tastes more like anise than it actually tastes like anything bitter. And that's the anise is there to cover up the extreme bitterness of the wormwood. But wormwood was used for, since before written records to help with various illnesses and really to stimulate digestion. It's there all along the way for those purposes, but also it was considered a vermifuge to help expel intestinal parasites. Whether it works for that well or not. I don't actually know, but we find references to wormwood being used in beer, much like hops is used today. There were wormwood wines used by the Greeks and the Romans.
Mm.
These, I wouldn't say they evolved into vermouth, but definitely vermouth comes from the German word for wormwood. And so vermouth is a wormwood drink as well. We just kind of forget that, I think, because again, it doesn't taste extremely bitter or anything like that. And people often use other kinds of wormwood in to make vermouth. And then when distilled spirits come along, then of course the doctors were putting wormwood into that as well. And that's how we got absinthe, and then the absinthe craze in Paris, which was more about phylloxera had destroyed the wine industry, and people needed to drink something because you certainly wouldn't want the drinking water in the middle of the 1800s in France. So people switched to absinthe, and that caused it did cause a lot of problems with alcoholism, which they were calling absinthism at the time. And really, absinthe took the blame. When the wine industry recovered, the wine producers continued to shed that blame on absinthe because they wanted their market share back. So we have that long history of wormwood in beverages, um, dating back to all uses of wormwood.
That's amazing. The more I learn about Artemisia as a genus, the more I love it. Like there's, so you have the absinthe as you discussed, and I've had the chance to sample some while traveling in France, and also visit the Chartreuse distillery. I don't know if you've ever been to that place. It's
Not yet.
fascinating.
It's my dream distillery to
You have
visit.
to go, and you have to be very quiet while you're there because the monks, they live on this silent mountain. So even travelers, you're not allowed to talk in certain areas while you're in the forest, which is a very great, very nice atmosphere for involving, engaging with the forest. So you have absinthe Artemisia. Then you have the Artemisia annua, which is used to treat malaria. Dr. Yu too won the Nobel Prize for that in 2015, which is amazing. Then these other really cool Artemisia species I've encountered recently. Like one is called tree wormwood, and it grows in Sicily. And the first time I encountered this plant, it made me just want to lay down and roll around in it. That's the best way to describe it. It smells so good. Like I don't know, it was like catnip for like the human. You just wanted to roll around, and it was really amazing. And in fact, they use that to bathe babies when they're newborns, as to bring them good luck. And then I was just in Japan, and I encountered a new Artemisia I'd never met before. I talk about plants like they're people. A new species I just met. The Artemisia princeps, and it's what they use to make that. I don't know if you're familiar with these green Japanese kind of desserts that have rice. It's like called yomoji is the name of the plant. But it's just showing me over and over again how important this genus is in many different food sources, both as foods and also as kind of in that intersection with medicine. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge genus from what I understand, and a lot of them do have the thujone in them, the
Uh-huh.
problematic compound
Hmm.
that's in grand wormwood. It's just in much higher concentrations in that grand wormwood. But any beverage product that uses wormwood has to test for a thujone level and be under a certain
Mm.
level. Essentially, in the United States, it's negligible amounts of thujone is what the definition is, and then they put a number to that. But
Mm.
when they went back and tested old bottles of absinthe, they found that it didn't really have all that much thujone in the old bottles. It was really um, much smaller levels and not dangerous at the levels that they were. So we're the absinthe that you can get today, perfectly legal in the United States and a lot of other countries,
Mhm.
is, as far as we know, pretty similar to the absinthe of old.
Oh, cool. That's neat. Very cool. Um, okay, well let's talk a little bit about the role of alcohol. So we know in medicine, alcohol, I guess, can serve as a medicine on its own as kind of a painkiller when undergoing some procedure. Um, but also it's used to kind of distill or extract the major elements of the plants. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, like what you learned in your studies about this intersection between alcohol and creation of medicines.
Sure. Well, before distilled spirits came about, and that's roughly 1200 is the year we put onto that. But most of the medicinal herbs that people would want to use, you have to put them in something liquid in order to consume them for the most part. And so that was what people were drinking, which would be in Egypt, that would be beer. That was a bread basket of the area. And with the Greeks and Romans, that would be wine. And then eventually, when spirits are developed, the alcohol does higher proof you get, the much better job the alcohol does at extracting the chemical as well as aromatic compounds in plants. Uh, it also helps to preserve those medicines in that it keeps it in a form that'll be shelf stable essentially, as well as, and I think we don't think of this that much, plants that are seasonal are now, we don't have to wait for the season in order to get your medicine that comes from a particular seasonal plant. So the infusion of plants into beer, wine, and spirits, sometimes redistilling them, is really a way to preserve medicine and make it liquid and drinkable. Alcohol does a lot.
It sure did, right? I think that's a really good point, though, about really extending shelf life of important herbs that people would have relied on as medicine. Um, I don't know how many of these that you've sampled. I'm sure many in your explorations of kind of this intersection between medicine and alcohol. But I'm thinking in particular of these bitter beverages, these aperitifs that are really popular in Europe. In my husband's part of Italy, where he originates, there's an amaro called Amaro Lucano, and it has all these different herbs. It's very bitter, but just delicious in this very weird way. Like you wouldn't want to drink a huge glass of it. You know, it's a small amount at a time, but I don't know. I'm getting the sense that maybe that has some ties to these features you're talking about preserving medicines. What can you share with us about those types of beverages?
For sure. Well, Italy is really a home to so many different and regionally specific, now
Mhm.
recreational that were once medicinal beverages. And the country wasn't unified until relatively recently compared to a lot of other places in the world. So it kind of makes sense that there are so many. And I've had Italians visiting where I live in San Francisco, and I've pulled Italian Amari off the shelf, and they've been like, "I've never heard of that," like because it's made 200 miles from where I live, so it is pretty amazing the great diversity that we get of all of these, and they do tend to have a lot of ingredients in common. Wormwood is often there, but cinchona is for the quinine is in everything. We don't really, we think of that as a tonic water thing, but cinchona tree bark, I call it the electrolytes of 1850s. Like, I don't know if it's going to do anything, but throw it in there. It sounds great. But it does have a nice bitter impact that
Mhm.
is helpful in the beverages. But and then we get gentian, very bitter root or flower, as well as rhubarb root. And it's not
Hmm.
the pie rhubarb that we're thinking of, that we eat the red stalks of it. It's Chinese or Turkish rhubarb, and we're eating the root of it, which is bright yellow. It was used for hair dye in some cultures, and it's got a smoky mustardy flavor that's
Hmm.
delightful. And that's another one that's in all of these beverages that we just don't really know about. All of those four things I mentioned are useful for digestion. Anything bitter is going to help stimulate the gastric juices and make your stomach gurgle and get ready for a meal, or to help digest a meal afterwards. And those regional Italian liqueurs may have started out as kind of a cure-all, like
Mhm.
if you're feeling oogie, have a little bit. If you have a toothache and you can't get to the dentist until Monday, have a little of it, etc. And it's also, some people use them kind of like daily vitamins. Have a little glass at night. That's like grandma's
Mhm.
little nightcap in the
Yeah.
different regions of Italy. So that's where we get this wide variety with like remixes of a lot of the same base bitter ingredients, and then with flavor additives to them, citrus and rose
Mhm.
petals and things like that result in these delicious things like Amaro Lucano, which I like.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fascinating. And I think a lot about, well, talking about gentian, I'm gonna spend a moment on gentian because it is such an intensely bitter plant. I had a chance once when I was working in Albania, and a local gentleman had a bag of it. So there are challenges with gentian because it's largely wild harvested, which means it's at risk. There's not a lot of sustainable practices around it, and in fact, it's kind of harvest and sale has been banned in some areas. However, where there's an economy, things get sold, right? Um, but I had an opportunity to just take a piece of the root cut in half and stick it to my tongue, and I have never ever experienced something as bitter as that particular, just straight from the root. It was just, I was like, wow, this must go a long way. When it comes to, like, you probably don't have to add that much to get a really intensely bitter flavor profile in these beverages.
Yeah, the first time I ever tried, I bought some at my local herb supply store and put it in some vodka to infuse it, and
Uh-huh.
just stuck my finger in to give it a little test after like a few minutes, and I was like, ah, my mouth. So yeah, I think a little bit does go a long way, and I've learned that some products use the roots and some use the actual flowers from it for a slightly different
Mm,
flavor. And there's a couple of
yeah.
different, there's a yellow one and a blue one, and people
Mhm.
use the different ones.
That's cool. So you mentioned that you're brewing things up at home, and this always makes me very curious. Is I like to, I'm not very good at many handcrafts, but like I can make some nice herbal infusions and some nice limoncello at home. So I'm wondering, like, what are your favorite kind of DIY recipes that you do at home with your botanicals, and even if it's just using like grain alcohol or vodka, like what are you doing at home?
Well, most of what I'm doing at home, and this is
Mhm.
like how nerdy am I, like I want to understand the botanicals individually, because you can never find just wormwood in a
Yeah.
beverage, or just gentian or whatever. There are some that are more forward with one botanical or the
Mhm.
other, but I want to be able to pick up a bottle of Campari and be like, ah, yes, rhubarb. And so in
There
order
you
to pick those out, I go to the herb store and I buy all of the individual botanicals and I make an infusion, and then I test them and I try to memorize what each herb tastes like on its own, so I can talk with more knowledge about the finished product. So that's mostly what I'm doing in terms of the bitter botanicals I'm buying at the shop. I'm not actually making any beverages out of them at all.
Okay. That's great. You're like, it's almost like, and I'm blanking on the name for the training that you have to really, give a full flavor profile of a wine or a vintage. Like you're kind of developing that, but for botanical cocktails is
Yeah, like
what
component tasting sort
component
of thing.
tasting. Yeah. That's great. That's fun. Yeah. Um, so out of these different components, I mean, are there specific components that you're more drawn to that you find to be more delightful? Or, I mean, and does that affect kind of which types of cocktails that you end up preferring?
A lot of it has to do with the final form that the brand has chosen, um,
Hmm.
and the mixability of them or not. So Campari, for example, we always mix it. Almost no one drinks Campari on its own, but it's essential in the Negroni, which has been trending
Yeah,
so
I
strongly
love
in
Negronis.
the past
Yes.
couple of years. I've been drinking them for a long time, but it's cool to do it now. And that's a real like mixable version of this remix of all of these ingredients, as opposed to the amaros like Lucano and Fernet Branca
Hmm.
that sort of don't necessarily play as well with other ingredients in a cocktail, or they will tend to take over. And so I'm looking at them in different ways depending on how mixable they are or not. And now there's been a big push into American variations of these old world European um, products, and it's been really fun to see the people will take uh, an impression that's like inspired by chartreuse, but also by the mountains in California. And so we'll
Ah,
have a different regionality expressed in the choice of botanicals from one part of the world or another. I'm really into that sort of, bitter terroir, I guess.
I like that. Yeah. I feel like there's also a trend, around development of new kind of gin ingredients or things that kind of bring a special flair to gin using local sustainable ingredients. And I find that to be really interesting. My friend Suzanne, who's actually been on the show before, she that's like one of the jobs that she does is she consults on like which botanicals can be sustainably added to different gin products. And it's a really cool thing to think about. Like, how do you take these things that are found in a certain landscape in a certain terroir, but like incorporate them in a sustainable way, which is really fun way to make new products. Yeah.
Yeah, and the regionality in gin had become a very
Hmm.
fun and exciting thing lately. And a lot of people for a while were doing seaside inspired gins. So you have a lot of
Yes.
oyster shells and seaweed. All of a sudden, we're in
Mhm.
your gin very, very often.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
I don't know if those either of those have any medicinal properties, but
Well, seaweeds are showing some interesting medicinal properties. I mean, people have used seaweeds, I think, for a very long time in medicine. Yeah, but a lot of it's still, of course, very poorly understood by the scientific community. We have a lot of work to do. I think sometimes these products make it into kind of popular culture and are, through other avenues well before we ever understand the full science behind how they work. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, well, I want to shift for a moment to talk a little bit about your newest book, which I hear is like flying off the shelves, um, which is amazing. Congratulations. So tell us a little bit about it. You're writing not about herbs in this book, but rather ice. Is that right?
ice and how to make it really. So
Uh-huh.
Doctors and Distillers was a book that was like a lot of very research intensive and used a lot of references to come up with it. And there's only like one little illustration per each of 9 chapters, whereas the ice book is a heavily illustrated book with fantastic pictures throughout. But
Fun.
it that's about how to make super clear ice and freeze stuff inside of it and carve it into diamonds and spheres
Ooh.
and flavor it and color it. And it's just things that you can do with ice cubes. And there are not all that many words to it. And because this is my arts and crafts that I do at home essentially, is
Mhm.
making weird kinds of ice. I
I
I've
think that's
done
great. That's a great hobby.
it's super cheap. It's water. And I because I've been doing that for over 10 years now, and I developed a technique for making clear ice at home without
Mhm.
moving parts, and it bartenders knew about it, but it's when the YouTubers and the Instagrammers and TikTokers started demonstrating it online that it really took off. And now there's ice talk and things like that of
Wow.
people really showing off their impressive ice to other people online. And so that did more for the popularity of the methods that I developed than anything else. And we hit good timing with the book coming out. It took a while to get a publisher interested in a book on ice cubes, but uh, and then the media is eating it up. There was a big New York Times story about the book and my history, and that sold out pretty much all of the copies currently in existence. There are more
That's
being printed
amazing.
as we speak. And then there's news this week: Starbucks is changing their ice, and so people have real deep thoughts about that. And so I've been getting
Okay.
calls from other media sources in the past day asking, so what is it about this nugget
What's
ice?
nice. So, it is funny, like how important ice is to our everyday routines. There's my like dream kitchen gadget is not going to be about like big cocktail ice. What I really, really want are one of those kind of sonicated ice machines that give you the little ice pebbles. There's something about it reminds me of my childhood of having big glasses of sweet tea with those little, ice pellets. It's just, yeah, ice takes so many forms and is tied to so many, I think, different experiences for people. So it does become an important part of the conversation.
It does,
Yeah.
and soon
Really
you'll
do.
get that ice at Starbucks.
Yeah.
According to the news, the crunchy ice, people are obsessed. And yeah, and it's really, I always think of the Pizza Hut, the red tumbler cup, with
Yeah,
that crunchy ice in it.
the
That's
crunchy
my
ice.
like
Yeah.
good memory of that crunchy ice. But it's also hospital ice that they just give you.
Well, I was thinking about that. Maybe that's why I liked it so much. I spent so much time in the hospital as a kid. I really like the ice. I hadn't thought of it that way, but you're
Like
right.
pro tip, get your ice from the hospital.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Well, that's so cool, and that's something I guess anyone can really play around with at home, with different ice forms, and yeah. Well, congratulations. I mean, I think every author's dream is when books fly off the shelves, and it sounds like you've mastered the art of book talk meets ice talk. So that's great. So what are you thinking next? I know you're just getting this out the door, but do you have any new things you're considering for the future, or things that caught your fancy while you're doing research on these two books?
I do. I have a couple things I'm pursuing to see if there's
Mhm,
enough there for a
mhm,
book. But I think in general my niche is the sort of popular science for cocktails.
mhm.
The ice book has some of that. It's not I didn't explain much of the science, but it's based on no understanding the science. And then Doctors and Distillers, of course, is the history of medicine, but also really I got really nerdy about gas science and how the scientists use understanding of naturally carbonated mineral springs and beer that's fermenting to come
Mm.
up with all sorts of discoveries, elemental gases and the germ theory of disease and all of that. It all
Oh,
comes
cool.
from fizzy water and beer. And that, so I took some time and explored that at depth in the book because I was really into it. But yeah, for other books I'm thinking of, they're along those lines as well. It's something that's like no one knew you needed to know about all of that.
But once you do, you're gonna be very glad you do. That's right. Wow. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back because, for all the listeners on the show, I think they've gotten the hint that I'm kind of crazy about fermented foods. And so I love anything that ferments and creates gases and like, how this transforms our flavors and our mouthfeel of foods. I think that's just really interesting. And also the health value of foods in some cases when the microbes help break down some of the molecules and release more nutrients. So,
Yeah, I was excited to learn that it's true that when people drank beer instead of water, that was getting a way to get nutrients as well as hydration at the same time. I thought
yeah.
that was just kind of like, well, I'm drinking the beer for because it has a lot of water in it.
I guess
Turns out that's
I'd
real.
be curious what the alcohol level used to be.
Yeah, not
Yeah,
super high, I don't think.
yeah, yeah,
And it
yeah.
was also really chunky. People had to, you had to, straws were invented to push through the floaty stuff on the top of beer
Oh,
in order
wow.
to get it. So the early depictions of people drinking beer are with a long reed stuck into a big vase of sorts to drink the beer underneath the surface.
I had no idea. That's wild. Cool. Well, okay, before we wrap, I have to ask, do you have a favorite cocktail recipe that you might be able to share with us?
Oh, well, let's just go with the Negroni since we were talking
Okay,
about it
yes.
earlier.
Great.
And that's also an easy one because it's equal parts, the ingredients. So that is the Negroni is it's a Italian classic and it is equal parts Campari, which is a red bitter aperitif liqueur from Italy, uh, and equal parts gin and red or sweet vermouth, and so 1 ounce each, and you're done. And the
Easy.
fun thing about the Negroni is that you can just add ice to your glass and pour those
Mhm,
ingredients on top and give it a quick stir. Maybe an orange peel zest on
mhm.
the top of it, but it's an unfussy drink that's got so many layers of complexity to it that it's a great drink before a meal or anytime.
That's great. I think you're right. It's the complexity of those bitters and all those different herbs that go into making, yeah, especially the Campari element really brings it out. It's nice.
Yeah,
Very, very cool.
the more I do my home experiments testing the rhubarb invention separately, the more I understand Campari, and that's my fun at home.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, Camper, where can I send folks to find you and find more about your work? Can you tell us about your website and your social media handles?
Certainly, alchemics.com is my website. That's been up for, I don't know, 15 years or so, and all of everything I've ever written is either there or linked from there.
Mhm.
And I get real nerdy on ice and have for more than a decade, as well as other kind of science adjacent cocktail information there. I also have two other websites. One is called Cocktail Safe, and this is kind of related to these medicinal ingredients that we're talking about, because things like quinine and wormwood are regulated, and you don't want to just have all that you can have
Yeah.
and drink. And with the TikTokers and Instagrammers, we got to be careful of dangerous flowers and plants. They just because
Mm,
they're organic and you got it from the forest doesn't mean it's safe to put in your drink. Poison
no.
ivy is also organic, and you know not to put it in your mouth.
Yeah.
So Cocktail Safe exists for as a reference, mostly for bartenders or consumers who want to know about safety and ingredients. Then I also have cocktailgreen.org, which is more about sort of finding new uses for citrus peels and things
Mhm.
like that that bartenders were very into, especially pre-pandemic. And then we all had to switch to plastic for a couple of years, but now we're back.
Now we're
We
back.
care about the
Yes.
environment again.
That's great. I mean, you're doing amazing work in the field, Camper, and yeah, I'm excited to continue to read your work. And thanks so much for coming on the show. I know that the audience is going to really enjoy this one.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. It's
Yeah,
nice to meet you.
yeah, exactly. You too. You've been listening to Foodie Pharmacology, the science podcast for the food curious, recorded for you today on Restream. I want to give a big shout out of thanks to our show's producers, to Rob Cohen and Christine Roth of Co-Conspiracy Entertainment. I also want to remind you, all of you foodies, if you're interested in supporting the show, you can head over to our website where we have lots of cool show swag. It's at mysterycontrol.com. We've got mugs and t-shirts and lunch boxes and all kinds of fun stuff on there for you to check out. All right, thanks so much for listening. Stay healthy out there, and I'll see you next time.